Hello and welcome to the Scholar Progenium. Today I thought we'd have a chat about getting started in bolt action events. So perhaps you're a new player who's thinking of diving straight in the deep end, or you're a veteran bolt action player, knows what they're doing but's considering going to their first event, or perhaps even you have been to a couple of events and you're wanting to look for tips on how to improve your standing in these early days of your competitive career. Then perhaps I've got something helpful for you in this video. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, today I thought it might be interesting if we had a discussion about getting started in competitive play and just some simple, straightforward tips that might be helpful. Now, if you're a veteran player, I'd much appreciate you adding your own thoughts down below in the comment section, as this is by no means going to be an exhaustive list. It's just something me and JP were chatting about on the weekend, and I thought, hey, that's quite an interesting little topic that I'd like to share with you guys. So what were the kind of things we were discussing? Well, I'm going to split this list into maybe tournament prep and mindset, and then some tips for how to actually win some games when you go to the event. So we'll start off with preparation for a tournament. So first things first, let's talk about the list. Now, you don't need a perfect list. In fact, I'd suggest the more familiar that you are with your list, the better. If you are trying something new and upgraded to your everyday list in your local meta, then make sure you know that list inside and out. You can't be blundering around not knowing what veterancy level your units are. You've got to know that mortar's regular, that mortar's inexperienced, that unit's vets, that unit's regulars. Seems like a simple thing to point out, but you'd be surprised. On top of that, know your rules, know your units. If you're using a unit that you've not used before, that you've newly acquired, then know how many machine guns it's got on the hull and that kind of thing. Again, it seems like such a simple and obvious thing to point out, but it's not something you can really make a mistake on. Now that seems really like gatekeeper-y, you might say, but I'm just saying it how it is. These places are totally friendly. You're always going to meet some lovely people at bolt action tournaments. That's just good manners at the end of the day, is to know your list, and it's going to help you win games if you know what you can rely on and what you can't rely on. It's going to help you make those more strategic decisions and more precise tactical decisions as well. Now, in terms of building a list, I would say overall broad brushstrokes. Have enough to deal with armour, have enough to dual armour, but you want to be focusing on winning that infantry game. That's where you're going to score objectives, that's where you're going to push up, advance, kill those outlier units, kill those support units. Winning the infantry game is key. And if you can build your list with that idea in mind, you hold off armour, be able to deal with the armour. But winning the armour game is not going to win you a game. But yes, if you can stick to those broad brushstrokes, having enough to handle the armour game, have enough anti-armour at the very least, whilst being able to really focus on winning those infantry engagements, that's not going to set you far wrong in most games. On top of that, I would say the main focuses when building a list are redundancy and flexibility. If you've got multiples of the same unit or units that can do the same job, it's just less to think about for you, and it means if something gets wiped out or an area of your list just crumbles, an area of your battle line crumbles, then you've got replacement units, you know what you're doing. You don't have to come up with wild crazy ideas, rely on a light mortar to hold an objective, stuff like that. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, I'm just saying having reliable consistency throughout your list is going to help you a lot, because you're going to be dealing with things you've never dealt with before. You need your list to be very flexible. That's the key here. Flexible but reliable, because ultimately you're going to play missions you maybe have never played before. You're going to be playing lists that you've never played before. Doesn't matter how many armies you and your mates have. Doesn't matter how many people are in your local meta. There's a very good chance you'll come across something you've never faced before, and that has some edge to it. You know, it's a spicy list, and you need to be able to adapt to that. And having a flexible list where you've got good mobility, good survivability, good damage output, just a nice balance of everything, a nice mixed bag potentially, but without too many different variety in units. Again, you're not going to go far wrong with that. It's just a good general idea. Another obvious tip, but something we can be guilty of not doing, is reading the rules. It's something that I have certainly done myself, especially with side games that I'm playing, is I may not even necessarily pick up a copy of the rulebook myself. I just learn off my mates as we're playing the game as stuff comes up. But if you're going to an event, then it's really about time that you read those rules, and make sure you're not going to get caught out. You're going to get caught out by stuff. That's going to happen anyway, but it's something you just got to take on the chin. But you need to know what's going on and give yourself every chance to make good decisions in advance so you don't get caught out by something that you should have known. And that comes up a lot. Now, when I say caught out by something, I don't mean some kind of got you moment where your opponent's like, haha, you didn't know this and now I have the upper hand. But more simply, just the fact that you might be planning some idea in your head, thinking that you're going to pull this thing off. And when you declare it, it doesn't turn out that way, just simply because of a rule you're unaware of. Or you just, but that doesn't mean you know every rule in the rule book. The last tournament that I went to, I learned something new, which I just hadn't stuck in my mind. I'd read it, but it just had not lodged itself in my memory, which is the fact that you can shoot out of two sides of a building. So if you take position in a building, you can shoot at two separate units, split fire, out of opposite sides of the building. Something that I hadn't been using in my own games and something that I was just basically unaware of. Now, it didn't lose me the game in any way, but it was like, wow, okay, fair enough, that's very interesting. And that's a big part of tournaments, and a big bonus of tournaments is picking up on those little things that you've overlooked in the past. So on that note, I think it's about time we talk about tournament mindset. And for me, in many ways, this is the most interesting part of the discussion. Now, I'm going to start off with a seemingly silly and simple rule, but that's make sure you've got a drink and a snack. If there's not going to be food available, make sure you take one with you. If you go into a little place where they do, like a gaming cafe where they do that kind of thing, then make sure you take the time to get that drink and that snack, especially around game 1 and between game 2 and 3. Very, very important stuff. I just find it keeps me in good spirits to be well nourished during a tournament, and it keeps me sharp as well, so I'm making good decisions throughout the day. I'm not getting tired and lazy game 3. The next tip is possibly the most important part of this video, and that is prepare to lose and embrace it, but go in there with a winning mindset. You're not going to a tournament just to lose games. You can go to your local meta and do that all day for free. You go in there to try and win and to test your mettle against other players that you've not faced before, maybe face people that play at a higher level than you've experienced before. And that's really what it's all about. It's about testing your mettle and just not being bothered if you lose. Just totally accept that. If you go to a tournament, unless you're a really good player, and even the best players, you're going to lose a game at some point, especially if it's a 2-day event. Now, I highly recommend, on the side note, for your first event, if you can, it depends if you have to travel to these things, so on and so forth. Of course, everyone's situation is different. But if you've got the availability, the choice between a little 1-day, a 3-match event, or a big sort of 5-6 match 2-day all weekender, I'd go ease in, go for the 1-dayer, and so you're not just having to lose 6 games in a row if things are going badly, because that's just going to put you off. You're not going to have a good time, however positive you are. But without getting sidetracked, have that mindset where you're totally fine with losing and it's all about learning. Treat it almost as a research expedition. Remember, it's a dice game. Sometimes the dice just go against you and you lose, and that's as simple as it goes. Sometimes your opponent's better than you and they beat you, and that's just as simple as it is. And sometimes it's a little bit of column A, it's a little bit of column B, and some other variables thrown in besides. On top of that, don't get in a huff if you get caught out by things. If you weren't aware of a rule, or you guys at home play it differently, but you're definitely wrong and the TO decides against you, that kind of thing. Hey, it's all part of wargaming. You're just not worth getting worked up about. You're there to learn, okay? If you're playing people who are better than you, it's not their responsibility to point out every possible eventuality that could happen as you're fighting things out, just in case you make a bad decision or you don't know what you're doing. There's a certain expectation that you know if your plans are going to work or not in the nicest possible way. So if you get caught out by something, hey, it happens to everyone all the time. It's just no big deal, and it's not worth beating yourself up about. An important thing is chat to your opponents. I'll say right now, some of my closest friends, people who gave readings at my wedding, are people that I have met at tournaments many years ago, and we've sort of realised we live in the local area and met up for further games and forged a friendship over time. So this is a great opportunity to socialise. Now, obviously you're there to play war games and you can't be slowing the game down by like chatting away non-stop. But it's nice to just get to know the person you're playing. And it's not, I've been to 40k events back in the day where I've faced people who are just, frankly, quite standoffish. Now that's not the majority by any means. The majority of people who go to these events are lovely people, but in Bolt Action, way more so. There's no reason to sort of be treating this as like, oh my gosh, it's me versus him, duel to the death mindset. Have a chat with the guy or girl, get to know. But yes, you're going to lose games. That's just the nature of the beast. When me and JP flew out to Denmark to play against Bo Mortensen and the Danish national team, just as a little training event that we filmed up for you guys earlier in the year. And if you haven't seen that, go check it out in the old catalogue, one might say. But I went out there with the mindset that I'm going to get my ass kicked all weekend and I'm going to just take in everything that I can, just absorb every little dirty trick, every sneaky maneuver, every bit of information, just every game style, because you're going to play players that are more aggressive in terms of their play style. They're going to come at you harder and faster than you have ever experienced in your local meta, and you're going to play against people who are wildly conservative. You just can't get your hands on them. They just refuse to engage you in a battle like you're used to, and so on, and everything in between. So it's not just about the crazy lists that you're going to face and the opportunity to play against cool and new interesting units, but you're going to be playing against cool and new interesting people with cool and new interesting playstyles. And a big part of this is just be friendly, have a chat, get on with people, just have fun, enjoy losing, but be like, wow, okay, man, I'm going to have to pick your brain after this game. Discuss the game, ask your opponent after the game, where did you think you got the upper hand? What was the moment where the game, turned against me? What do you think of my list? What should I drop? What should I add? You can take all of their opinions with a pinch of salt. If you don't agree with them, then you don't agree with them. It's like, whatever, you don't have to follow their advice. But it's just interesting to get another person's view on the game. And if they're a better player than you, then you might pick something up for them, and it just is what it is. A question I like to ask at the start of a game is how long someone's been playing Bolt Action and do they go to a lot of events? Now, I think this is a good question. First of all, it's a great icebreaker. It gets the conversation flowing. You can start sharing war stories. On top of that, it's a good measure of what you're dealing with. Now, from my perspective as someone who's been to a lot of events, if I find out that the other person's been to a lot of events, then I know I've got to be on my A game. I'm, better sharpen up quick. However, if you're maybe a new player, it lets you know, first of all, how much you can rely on their rules knowledge. If they're, a real veteran player, they go to loads of events. Hey, they might still get a rule wrong, but you can probably not have to lean on the rule book as much as if you're both relatively new players with only a few games under your belt. And if they say something's one way and you are convinced it's the other way, it's time to get that rule book out and settle the discussion the proper way. On top of that, it gives you an idea of how much you could possibly learn from that person. If they seem like, they're telling you stories about how, they went to Worlds this one year, or they went up to Scotland this one time and so on and so forth, then A, they're going to have loads of interesting stories to tell, which is really cool. And on top of that, they're probably going to have some really good tips for you at the end of the game, and it's something you should definitely lean on. So we've had a little chat about tourney prep. We've discussed how to have a good mindset so that you enjoy the day and learn a lot from it. Now let's talk about some tips for how to actually win some games. You see, it depends on how the matchup system is, but first game you can get absolutely anybody. They could be amazing, they could be trash. Next game, if it's set on win-loss, then you're going to be playing someone potentially more of your level. If you won your first game, hurrah, but now you're really in the pickle because you're going to be playing someone else who's won their first game. If it's just totally random, then you could get 3 amazing opponents and just lose every game all day. You could get people who are in between or at your level, and you've got a good chance of winning every game. And that's why you want to go in there with a winning mindset. You want to try and win every game that you can. So don't be lazy and don't sort of be foolhardy in your decisions. I think when you're playing a competitive game of bolt action, although sometimes if you're in a losing position, you've got to go for those big swings, you've got to take some risks. When you're level or you're beating someone, it's best to, and I'm not saying don't be aggressive, I'm not saying be conservative or hold units back. That's not what I'm talking about here. But on a meta level, you want to be just playing a tight game where you know the reason for why you're doing certain stuff. You're pushing in certain directions. You've got an overall game plan, and you're not kind of just flailing around going, I'll fire this at that, I'll fire this at that, just with no kind of coherency to the way you're activating units. You want to be using your stuff together as a cohesive force to achieve certain objectives. A good example of foolhardiness is going for an epic, potentially game-winning shot that's just highly, highly unlikely to come off and much more likely to put you in a really bad position. So moving a tank out of cover to get an angle on another unit, even if it's a really, really good move, if chances are you're hitting on a 5 and maybe you're not penning very well and your opponent's almost certainly going to be able to counter that tank and knock it out, then you're just putting yourself in a bad position. You're just chucking massive percentage points of your list out the window for a very little chance of getting a game. So you want to be making decisions that have a high likelihood of success, and you want to be activating units and targeting units that have a high likelihood of success, even if it's not your first priority unit. If you've got a better chance of hitting and destroying one unit than another, often it's better to just go for that and just play it out like a battle and just get the upper hand in terms of the battle, and you'll be able to take those objectives and win the game as part of an organic process. But don't be flailing around. As I've said, keep your eye on the prize. Know why you're doing something is going to put you in a better position in terms of the game, but don't feel absolutely restricted. I must do this in order to achieve my objectives. You've got to be open to taking good opportunities when they come your way. So it's just about being flexible, but being decisive at the same time. A huge point to make is discussing every piece of terrain before the battle begins. That's one of those moments where you get caught out. You've not discussed the terrain with your opponent before you've got started. You've presumed something's hard cover, but he reckons it's soft cover. Or you thought something was obscuring and your opponent couldn't see through it, but they very much can. And if it comes to a TO decision, that could go against you. So it's just about make sure you have that conversation. It's a huge tip that I cannot underline enough. And on top of that, make sure that you check your win conditions. It might be that you get mixed up under the pressure of your first game. It might be that you're tired and you presume you know what the win conditions are in your third game, but you've made a mistake and you've thrown a game away because of that. And why lose a game that you could have otherwise won? You're going here to try your best to test your mettle, okay? You've got to be okay with losing. Every loss you've got to treat as a learning experience, but you're going for those wins, so know your win conditions. It's happened to me at the start of version 3, the first tournament that I went to. It was like the first weekend that the book had come out, And I'd even had the book, an early release edition for the channel, so I had no excuse for this. But I just thought that the double envelopment game, the win conditions were the same as second edition. I had even played the game beforehand, but it was my last game and I was tired, and just this went out of my mind. I didn't check the win conditions at the start of the battle. I thought that you got a point for every kill, 2 points for being in the opponent's deployment zone, and 3 points per unit that ran off the board. And of course, it's changed. There's no points for kills. There's only 1 point for getting your opponent's deployment zone, but there are 3 for getting off the board. And I played the first 2 or 3 turns of this game without realizing this, and it, could have really thrown a spanner in the works if I hadn't been able to adapt, and I'd sort of won the game anyway. But it's very lucky that I did, because I could have easily thrown it away by just that simple oversight. One point that JP made that I thought was very interesting was, if you've got your opponent on the back foot, don't let them recover. That's the point where it's time to push them. If they've got pins on somewhere, then hammer that part of the board and really crush it. If you've got the opportunity to wipe a couple of units out, even if it's not necessarily focused on a particular objective that you're trying to achieve on the board, then go for the throat, because a lot of the time that could be mid-game and those units are going to come back and get you whilst you're trying to hold objectives later on in the game. They're still going to be active. So sometimes if you see a vulnerability in your opponent's list, even if it's not part of the game plan, just go for it. Now I want to take a quick second to talk about deployment, because I think this is one of the main areas where people go wrong when they're new to tournament play. Maybe they're a newer player, or maybe they're just unfamiliar with the force that they're facing, and so they don't really know how to counter deploy against it, and so on and so forth. And this is a really common area where mistakes are made and where games are thrown away before the first dice has even been pulled from the bag. And it's very common because there's a lot of unfamiliarity. You're playing armies, factions you've never played before that your mates don't own. You're playing army styles and play styles that you've never played before as well. So I thought deployment would be a really good area to focus on. But of course, there's loads of sections and bits in this video that I'm going to do expanded videos on in the future, and I can do an expanded video on deployment if you guys want. But some broad brushstrokes, some broad tips. If you are picking the table edge and it's your choice, then I generally would rather have a better table half to maneuver and fight within than have a best deployment zone, if that makes sense. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, because sometimes you're playing table quarters, half the time you don't get to pick, so on and so forth. But that brings me on to my other idea, which is kind of try, when you're looking at the tabletop, to envisage the flow of units around the objectives, not just where units are being deployed or moving on during first wave. You want to be thinking about, where are the areas that my opponent is going to have to move through? Where are the areas that I'm going to have to move through? What's the obscuring terrain that totally blocks line of sight that I can safely position behind, but my opponent can also get up behind as well? If it's an objective game, I'm placing those objectives in an even format so that they're balanced across the board, so I don't sort of pile them all on one side of the board and then my opponent wins the dice off and they pick that side of the board and I'm fighting to control things. So just be aware of that. If your opponent puts one deep in one table edge, just mirror it, put it in the other side. Don't think too hard about it, just mirror kind of what your opponent does and try to make those objectives evenly balanced on both sides in the middle of the board. Now a huge tip, and this is one for people who are just trying to up their game in general, is deploy for where you and your opponent will be fighting over, not just to counter your opponent's deployment. Bolt action is often won on maneuvers, and so look, right, okay, we've got 5 objectives. This is where we're going to be fighting. This is the hard cover surrounding those objectives. This is the cover that you'll have to move through to take that objective and that you'll be able to fight from to pressure units on that objective. Take that all into account. And then if you're going to be focusing on a couple of those objectives, think how your units are going to flow up to those objectives and how you can shoot your opponent's units as they move up. If there's a nice bit of wall 8 inches away from an objective that your opponent will be able to hide behind and either shoot you if you're holding it or move up to and then take the objective. And that's going to be a key position throughout the game, clearly. Then it doesn't matter if your artillery unit can't necessarily see the best units from your opponent's deployment zone. They're not going to be there. They're going to be moving. They're going to be moving to that key position just off that objective. So make sure you've got an artillery unit or a fire support unit pointing at that position. So it's not about counter-deploying your opponent's deployment. It's about counter-deploying where they're going to be. So essentially, you're looking for those fire angles from your deployment zone for your fire support units that give you a nice view with no obscuring terrain in the way. That's going to let you shoot at multiple positions across the battlefield. Or you're looking to be able to have a really nice angle on key positions across the battlefield that are going to be useful later on. A tip in terms of deployment and just planning before the game starts playing is how aggressive are you going to be and how mobile is your opponent's list, because ultimately it's much easier to take an undefended position and defend it than it is to fight up to a defended position and seize it off your opponent. So if there's objectives in the middle of the board and you're looking at your opponent's force, you're thinking, that's not a very fast force, they've not got many transports, there's not many ways they can get up the board fast, and that's an option for you, then take that ground and fight from there and set up your fire support units knowing that's what you're going to do. Kind of have that in mind. Don't set up your fire support units for the long game and then all of a sudden realise, wait a minute, I can grab those 2 objectives and it's going to take my opponent 3 turns to take them off me, and they're probably not going to be able to do it. But then you don't have the fire support in position that you need, so ultimately they do seize those objectives off you and you lose the game. Now, this is all much higher level. I could have a massive discussion about this and do a whole video in itself in terms of when's the right time to take objectives. But I'm just saying, kind of have that tempo in mind of what it's going to be like when you're playing against your opponent's list. Are they super aggressive and they've got loads of transports? Then don't be setting units up on their own on flanks. Don't be setting units up well forward that are in a vulnerable position and unsupported, because your opponent's going to grab them off you. So if they've got a fast moving list, deploy knowing they're coming at you. If they've got a defensive list, deploy with that in mind as well. So just be taking that into account regardless of whether you've played against the army before or the faction before or that kind of style of list before. It's just silly to overlook very obvious markers about how someone's about to play into that game. If your opponent's got long range scary units, look for that obscuring terrain, look for how you can use that to your advantage to get where you need to go. Maybe you're going to have to do a couple of runs and less shooting to position yourself on a certain objective, but if you can get there safely and their big expensive dangerous unit isn't firing to any effect, then you're putting yourself at a massive advantage. You're swinging the game in your favour. A simple tip, but one that I see people getting caught out on when they're brand new players, is don't set up all your units around a building if your opponent has a multiple launch rocket system in their list, because you can target buildings, you don't have to target specific units, and you can measure and hit every unit within 6 inches of that building, and that can just lose you a game before you've even got started. Now that is a very specific tip, and I'm trying to keep this to broad brushstrokes, but the general theme here is that you're going to pick up those specifics when you play your own games, so I'm not trying to worry about those kinds of things too much. A cool tip from JP, something that he certainly likes to do, is if you finish the game early, have a chat with your opponent, of course, but if you've got the time, go up and watch the end of the top table game, because you can pick up some really cool ideas from those guys. It gives you an idea of tempo in particular. You can see how they're playing against each other and how they're using their units in those particular situations and against the opponent and the list that they're facing. And it just allows you to sort of take those things in. It's kind of like watching battle reports to learn, which is something that I know we all do. Now, I could come up with a whole laundry list of quick random tips to give you guys, but I don't want to waffle on any longer, and I want to give my veteran viewers the opportunity to fill that out in the comment section down below. So let me know what you guys think about what I've said today, and please do add in your own quick tips for people who are just getting started in competitive play. I'm happy to do a follow-up video to this and expand further on certain points. But long story short, good luck out there, and I hope you have a lot of fun. So with all that being said, I hope you found this video interesting and entertaining. This has been the Scholar Progenium. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.